more and more people this winter are using wood to fuel their fires. And even though you may buy wood that's already cut from garden centres, petrol stations and off the side of the road, quite often they're quite big, so it's quite good to cut them down a bit more. But as you cut the wood and the pieces start getting smaller and they don't want to stand up on their own, it can be quite dangerous trying to cut this down with one of these. So today I've got a really nice project for you that will take away the risk of cutting off your hand, only cost you £10 or £12, and also means that you can cut this amount of kindling literally in 5 or 10 minutes here on Proper DIY. My plan is to use a steel bar connected to a piece of wood to slice firewood by using leverage, which I can safely control. I'm designing as I go along here, so I start by cutting out a template of the wood and the steel bar in cardboard, which I can then play with and mark up as I figure out how this whole thing's going to work. The firewood I have, and generally the stuff that you can buy in the shops as well, is all around about 8 to 10 inches long. So I want to make something that can accommodate this, plus another couple of inches, either slightly longer and slightly smaller as well. To anchor the bottom of the wood so I can split it, I'm looking at using a step in the timber that it can sit on while I push down the cutting arm. As soon as I start making it, I realise a few things. Firstly, the cutting arm really wants to be horizontal or lower when you push on it. Secondly, the steps have to bite the firewood rather than slip off, so they have to be angled right. And also they need to be pointing close to the pivot point so I can get enough leverage to actually split the wood. I tried different ideas and I also changed my mind and decided to use a 4x4 offcut instead of the 6x2 that I was going to use at first, because I think it's going to be easier to fix it to a wall or a post. I also have some small aluminium angle that I can use to reinforce the front of each step. Okay, so I've spent 5 minutes playing about with this. Okay, 30 minutes playing about with it, and I've got a bit of a plan. So what I've sort of decided upon is a series of sawtooths, but rather than each one being horizontal, the problem with that is it steps back and back and back if it's horizontal. You end up with no timber here at all. So each one actually turns slightly to aim at like the sweet spot, which is over here somewhere. And then what the plan is that this I'll put on the corner with some screws, maybe not these ones, maybe some longer ones, screw it through the timber, because also pushing down on there is a tendency for this to split along the grain. So if I put some screws in across that potential failure line, then it will help pull everything together just in case it decides to split off. Especially down the bottom here, there's this real tendency for this last bit just to suddenly shear off along the grain. So if I put a couple of screws in there, that'll just give it extra strength. If I use a little bit of my practice kindling, then it sort of seems to work and it sort of feels right. So I'm going to stop there. I'm going to draw it up accurately on my bit of 4x4 timber, then take it to the bandsaw and cut it out. and everything was going well until I offered up the piece for the very last cut. And only then did I realise that my bandsaw hasn't got a big enough throat to cut the piece that way round. Can you believe it? That serves me right for buying such a cheap small bandsaw, doesn't it? So while Stuart transfers all the information onto the other side so he can cut the piece round the other way, it's a good time to stop and tell you that this video is being sponsored by ITS for all the tools you need. Now ITS are just coming to the end of their Black Friday sale. However, there's still lots on offer. This Black Friday sale is one of the biggest ITS sales ever. There's hundreds of deals available, including all the big brands like Milwaukee, Makita, and of course DeWalt. And as usual, there's next day delivery if you order before 7 p.m. There's also a section called Black Friday Clearance with massive savings on essentials like hand tools and power tool accessories. And of course, lots and lots of deals on my favourite, which is power tools, including this DeWalt drill and impact driver set with 2 small batteries for £99 plus VAT, which is an excellent Christmas gift for any new DIYer. And as usual, if you haven't already used my code and you spend more than £60, pop in proper DIY when you check out and you'll end up with this goodie bundle being sent to you with your order. Right, let's go back to the workshop and see if Stuart has managed to finally do this cut. This angle is 20 by 15 millimeters and it's easy to cut on the miter saw. I've orientated the pieces so the short side is on the horizontal part of the step, so I can make the steps around about 17 millimeters deep so I can get more in, and the long side going down means I've got more room for the screws to go through. So that's the timber part just about finished, reinforced with these just aluminium corner pieces. And I think that's going to make quite a nice bearing on each one of those, ready to chop down. I don't think anything's going to fail there. It's all pretty strong actually, and that gives quite a nice reinforced corner to each one of those. If I didn't do that, I think in time the timber would just wear away, but with just a little bit of aluminium and the screws going through past the grain line that would naturally split if a lot of pressure had been put on it, I think that's quite a nice job. All I need to do now is to put a slot in the top so I can put a bolt through so I can get a pivot in it. But I'll do that once I've sorted out the bar. Now the bar that I'm using is mild steel bar. This one is 35 millimeters by 6 millimeters, and I've got this from another project that I was doing. But I've just looked up on eBay. It's quite easy to find 30 millimeters by 6 millimeters, 600 long for £7 or £8. That's the sort of cost that we're talking about. So the plan is to put a cutting edge along the bottom here. I'll grind it so I've got a nice sharp cutting edge, and I'll also cut it down to about 600 millimeters long, so it's a couple of foot long, which would be quite a nice pivot as well. Only then will I put a bit of a slot in here and sort out the pivot point. So I think first of all I'm going to work on this. I first cut the bar to length, then start rounding off both ends. If you haven't done much with an angle grinder before, one piece of advice I can give, I've learnt from accidents we used to sometimes have on site, is grinding using the side of the disc uses a different type of disc than cutting, which uses the edge of the disc. Although they can look similar, cutting discs are a lot thinner to make the cut easier and are not designed to be worn away on the sides by grinding. If you do this, it will work to a certain extent before very quickly getting so thin it shatters at 9,000 RPM, which tends to always educate those involved. At the pivot end, I drill a hole that will eventually take a bolt, and then get on with making the cutting blade by equally grinding down both sides. You'll notice by this point that I'd used up all my DeWalt batteries, so I resorted to using my Aldi grinder instead. So after quite a lot of grinding, I finally got quite a nice edge on my, I suppose you'd call it guillotine actually, because this is the pivot point. This is a cutting edge, and then obviously I've got a handle, it's going to be used like this. So probably guillotine is the best description for it. So all I need to do now is mount it in my block. And I know the pivot point is going to be around about here, so I can drill a hole all the way through. And I'm just going to mount it with a nut and bolt through this hole so it pivots. But it does mean that I need to cut a slot this way to be able to get it in the middle of this piece of timber. Now there's a couple of different ways of doing this. I think the bandsaw is going to be the best way, and I could freehand it on the bandsaw, 2 cuts. But if I do that, I know that I'm going to get a wavy cut where some areas might be too close together and some areas are going to be too far apart, and it's all going to be a bit wibbly wobbly. So I'm going to use this on the bandsaw using a fence. But what I'll do first of all is just pack it out between this and the fence with a spacer that is exactly the same thickness as the bar, which is 6mm. And then on the second cut, take the spacers away, it'll move over 6mm and do another cut. That means I'll end up with a cut in here that is the thickness of the spacer plus the thickness of the kerf of the blade. Now the blade I've got on the bandsaw at the moment is quite a fine blade, which means that the kerf is probably less than even a millimetre. It's not very much at all. So I'm going to use that as my wiggle room. So I'm going to cut a 6mm slot plus the kerf of the blade, which should give me just enough for this to move freely. The other thing I need to do is, even if I do 2 cuts down here, it's still connected at the bottom. Now that's not really a problem. You normally get a chisel and just sort of cut in there and it just pop out. But this is quite a large block. I don't think I'm going to get a chisel all the way down there. So to make it easier for that to pop out, I think what I'll do first is I'll just drill a hole at least 6mm wide all the way through, and then when the 2 cuts come down to it, in theory that bit of timber should just pop out. Between my 6mm spacers and the workpiece, I use a scrap of timber, so it's sliding along that rather than pushing the spacers out of the way. My plan worked, and I end up with a nice fit where the bar can move freely but without twisting at all. To see how it works, I just use a nut and bolt. Although in its final form, I used a second nut as a locking nut so it doesn't gradually work loose. The bar, being 6mm thick, is a little tough on your hands when you're putting pressure on it, so I decide to make a handle to spread the load. I find another offcut of treated timber that I can cut down to slightly bigger than the size of the bar and around about 6 inches long with a piece either side. With it all clamped in place, I drill through one side, then through the steel, making sure not to go through the other piece. This means I can use a countersink screw biting into the opposite piece to pull the two together. I do this 6 times, 3 on each side, so I end up with a reasonably strong fixing. With everything in place, I can sand the excess wood away and round everything over so it's easy to the touch. And here's the finished product, painted and mounted to a post in the paddock, right next to my firewood, where I intend to be using it. And I must say, it works just as I'd hoped. One thing I didn't realise is as you cut firewood, it doesn't always split all the way down. So it's useful to have these other steps at the top to be able to make the cut deeper and deeper until it finally splits off. I tried bigger logs on it as well, but really you need to nibble sections off of the side. I found the limiting factor here not to be my guillotine, but just the pressure you can exert yourself onto the bar. And I must admit, even though I say it myself, this is an absolute success. I decide where I cut it and when I'm going to put the pressure on, meaning I can keep my fingers well away from the dangerous end during the cut. And it's also quick as well. I'm surprised actually how quickly I filled up this bucket. I don't even need this much kindling. So I hope you enjoyed this video. I would urge anyone that is worried about cutting their hand off with an axe to think about making one of these. It doesn't take much and it's really cheap as well. So easy to control. And I've got 1 or 2 more left to do. So please go and check out our Patreon page and I will see you next time. Oh, this is so much fun.